Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. The way that we approach sports, exercise, and even health for women in our communities, in our nations, in our counties across the globe is quite different from how we would ever dream about talking about it when it comes to men. Most of these differences in approach seem to be grounded in the myths that lead to misinformation that have formed the narratives that we tend to use when we form our perspectives about women's health and, more importantly, women's athletic performance and capabilities, in which we're going to talk about here. I'm not saying that health is less important than athletic capabilities. It's just not what we're going to talk about. The ideas of and the ideals about athletic performance and competition is grounded in a principle of fairness of competition. This fairness of competition idea seems to become a story that jumps to the forefront of conversations whenever we see stories about non-conforming athletes competing in women's sports. Stories that lead to everyone voicing an opinion that may or may not actually be grounded in the understanding of how the human body works. Which leads to the question, do these non-conforming athletes get a competitive advantage in women's sports? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
So there are 2 points that we have to start off with when we start looking at this idea about non-conforming athletes and non-conforming athletes, particularly within women's sports. When we're talking about non-conforming athletes, we're talking about individuals that do not conform to gender ideals as it relates to man-woman or male-female. A lot of times this has touched a very hot button topic, which we'll cover later on, which is the idea about the intersex and the transgender individual. When we start looking at women's sports, this becomes more of an issue, if we want to think about it in terms of an issue that has plagued, put quotes around that, the idea about women's sports throughout the history of women's sports, particularly international competitions of women's sports. This is not a new idea about trying to ensure that women are women, men are men in terms of international competitions. And it led to very draconian measures that women were subjected to very early in international competitions in history. If we look at the historical perspective, particularly within the Olympic and international Olympic style events, where women athletes were subjected to anatomy examinations that no male athlete would be subjected to, simply because someone would raise the question whether or not that the female was actually a female. And this goes into one of the biggest myths and misconceptions out there as it relates to this fairness of competition idea that men would simply just dress the part of a female in order to compete and win. There have been almost no recorded episodes of that actually taking place. There are a few anecdotes out there. There are a few identifications of males who had cross-dressed and attempted to compete as females in early Olympic competitions, but they were found out early within the competition, and there's been no recorded event of a male actually winning in female events. And so that kind of talking point gets nullified if we actually look at the historical record. But that's not the big idea here when we start looking at this non-conforming issue, particularly for those of you who are kind of following the news coming out of the Olympics currently. We're recording this the first week of August 2024. It's actually August 2nd, 2024 that we're recording this. And over the last week through the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris, there have been reports about non-conforming women boxers that are somehow getting an unfair advantage against their other women boxing competition because of their chromosomal biological sex. And so when we start talking about biological sex versus gender, there's 2 different avenues of play here. This is where a lot of people start getting lost in the weeds in terms of how we actually identify individuals. Gender is a sociological marker. It's a sociological term. When we start looking at the biology of the genders, what we're looking at is we're looking at basically one difference in chromosomes that's going to change the way in which some tissues develop and the way in which some hormones are going to develop. This is where we look at the X and Y chromosomes. And one of the things that has been in the forefront of the news recently is a couple of boxers who have that are chromosomally XY. So when we start looking at the chromosomes, we start talking about XX, XY. What we're really looking at is what genetics set up for someone to be sociologically identified as male versus socially identified as female, based off of how the genes and how the genetics lead to changes in expression of the genes, changes of expression of our physical traits that may or may not actually provide some sort of advantage. And that's where we have to start looking at what type of issues can come about. And by issues, what we're really talking about is we're talking about what type of competitive advantage can be incurred by having slightly different genetic makeup relative to the rest of the competitors that you might be competing against. And this is where we're going to get lost in discussion because of the fact that we have very limited research. We have very limited research, and the research that's out there tends to be slanted towards trying to confirm a thought or an opinion. When we start looking at this idea, particularly as it relates to the XY female competing, and we have to be very careful with this identification. So the two people that are being identified within the news are XY in terms of their genetics. XY in terms of genetics is what we would consider to be biologically, quote unquote, male if we were to combine the genetics with the sociological identification. The Y chromosome itself incurs different types of genes that are going to stimulate different types of tissue growth and different types of modification of tissues, as well as expression of testosterone in the individual due to changes in enzymes that occur. So both males and females are producing testosterone. The difference is how much testosterone is being produced and what is the pulse rate at which testosterone is occurring. Part of this has to deal with how the feedback loops are set up within the body. Part of this has to do with the number of cells that are going to be producing the hormones. Part of this has to deal with other factors that come into play as relates to how the tissues are going to be responding to the hormones themselves, which is why it's kind of a misnomer or misconception to classify someone as doping based off of how much hormone is present, or look at somebody have a competitive advantage because of having so much hormone in circulation. Part of what goes into play when we start looking at this hormone issue is the receptors at the tissues and the use of that hormone by the body. Just because I have a hormone that's high in circulation doesn't mean I'm actually getting an advantage from having that high amount of hormone. This is where we start getting lost in the weeds with, oh, the person is XY, which means they're going to be producing more testosterone, which means they're going to have a competitive advantage in strength and power events. That's not necessarily the case. In the long term, I will have greater changes in musculoskeletal tissue development, being XY versus XX, in terms of type of muscle tissue, in terms of density of bone, in terms of likelihood to have hypertrophication or growth of skeletal muscle and growth of bone. I will see slight differences in the way in which I respond to the recruitment of the muscle, but that's going to be dependent upon my responsiveness to the hormone, not just having the hormone. And this is where we start getting lost in the weeds. If I don't have enough responsiveness to the testosterone to have the morphological development to male, I don't necessarily automatically have an advantage over the sociologically identified females that are XX. And that's because there's a whole host of factors that come into play when we start looking at competition and competitiveness that goes hand in hand with training and training adaptations, which is what we're going to spend a good chunk of the next 5-10 minutes discussing in terms of how might we see differences in the XY versus the XX, particularly for the females, as relates to training adaptations and training adaptations that lead into competition. One of the things, once again, we're hampered with is the fact that all of the research that we have is looking at the issue through a clouded lens of trying to point out gender differences in strength, gender differences in training responses, looking at the what is now sociologically referenced as the cisgender versus the transgender, with the underlying or the kind of umbrella idea within this is the differences that we would expect to see if we happen to look at the transgender athlete. One of the things that we look at when we start looking at these training adaptations, these training differences, when we start looking at the cisgender research subjects, the cisgender volunteers, is we're not actually looking at athletes. What we're looking at is we're actually looking at resistance training and resistance exercise responses more than actually looking at the athletes. So we're hampered in terms of what we can actually answer. Do we actually get a competitive advantage from being XY competing against XX? And that would be women XX, women XY, not male XY, female XX. When we start looking at the principal differences that we see in terms of the skeletal muscle responses, males tend to have a higher proportionality of the excessively fast twitch type 2 fibers relative to the other type 2 fibers. And we'll see training responses across all fiber types that are slightly different than what we see as relates to the female resistance training responses. That doesn't mean we're going to necessarily see the same exact thing in terms of athletic responses, even though there is a very good correlate in between the excessively fast twitch fibers, the type 2X fibers, and the ability to have fast, explosive movements, powerful movements that we would expect to see in sports such as with the boxing that is at the heart of the news cycle right now as relates to this issue in terms of women in sports and female competition. When we start looking at these training adaptations, the other thing we have to kind of look at is what type of fiber responses are we going to see in terms of hypertrophication, in terms of tissue growth. And once again, looking at the cis male, cis female, XY male, XX female, in terms of the responses that we see, we actually see differences in terms of what type of tissue will grow, what type of tissue will respond, where we see a difference in the hypertrophication that takes place within the tissue based off of the fiber type that is going to grow, the fiber type is going to respond to the resistance exercise, to the training adaptations that we have. Within this, we're going to see differences in overall rates of growth, overall rates of power development that can favor the cis male over the cis female. But this does not equate, this does not relate to any type of differences that we might see in between females who are XY, females who are XX, as the females who are XY have differences in responsiveness to testosterone and differences in the receptor responses to testosterone that will not be equivalent to what we see with the XY male. One of the things that becomes more apparent when we start looking at the hormonal responses and the responses that we see at the tissues based off of the changes in hormonal responses is that males tend to produce greater amounts of contractile proteins within the training responses versus what we see with females. And that has to do with what type of hormone responses we see as relates to responses to training and the tissue growth that we see. Once again, this is not within the athletic competition. This is not within the athletic population. This is within the resistance training population. Now, what is important to understand is that the changes that we're going to see based off of the training responses combined with the hormonal responses, particularly when we start looking at the hormonal responses, is where within the normal curve anybody's going to fall as it relates to being low, normal, or high in terms of hormone concentration and hormone responsiveness. This is where we're going to see a variety of both training adaptations, hormonal adaptations, as well as performance improvements based off of where the person lies within the hormonal continuum, as well as the training adaptation continuum that has a combination of factors that come into play, which includes nutrition, training intensities, psychological and cognitive drives towards training and towards competition that may have a sociological influence on it based off of how the person sees themselves within their gender role and how that gender role is being used as motivational factor in terms of outward performance. And this is where we cannot stipulate that just because someone is XY in terms of their genotype instill upon them a competitive advantage against those who might have a different XYXX combination within the female competition. And so to simply state that someone is XY automatically has a competitive advantage, someone who's XY is automatically male, does not actually fall in line with what we see in terms of physiology, in terms of biology. And this is where we have to be very careful in terms of what we have sociologically versus what we have physiologically and biologically. This is where we have to understand how the body works and focus the discussion in terms of competition, in terms of athletic performance, on biology, on physiology, on anatomy, not necessarily on what we would hope would be the case in terms of sociological identifications, in terms of gender identifications. This is where, based off of the social inclination, based off of the social motivation, we tend to see excessive competitiveness within a lot of the female athletes as they are basically pushed towards having to be more male in the way in which they present themselves as an athlete, even though sociologically it can get looked down upon and can call into question some of their gender identification for the female athlete in particular. Sociological factors that combine with the biological expression of various hormonal issues that can lead to some people thinking that female athletes are in fact male in terms of the presentation of themselves based off of either their body image or the way in which they compete. But what we have to remember is just because of this kind of impression, it doesn't necessarily make them automatically male because of the factors that come into play as it relates to where they lie within the phenotypic expression of that genotype of the XYXX chromosomes and the gender identification that we have sociologically for that person. But we also have to look at how within the variety of responses that we have, where do they lie within the normal curve of responses that come into play, where we may or may not actually have performance adaptations and performance advantages simply because of the individual's genotype. Simply because of how the person is genetically set up does not automatically establish that they're going to have a competitive advantage. It's this kind of idea that gets welded into and woven into the narratives that we hear, the narratives that we read about, particularly from the political side of this whole debate, this whole discussion, as relates to the intersex individual and where the intersex individual or the non-conforming individual should be allowed or should not be allowed in terms of competing. And this is going to take us into a different discussion. And that different discussion is the idea about the transgender athlete and whether or not the transgender athlete has any type of competitive advantage or a competitive disadvantage based off of their transition between sociologically identified gender and the anatomical, physiological responses that are taking place within their body based off of the transition that they have in between male and female as relates to their outward appearance, their anatomy, and their hormonal physiology in order to match what they have kind of developed based off of fetal developmental sequences in terms of their gender identity. And that's something we'll pick up in a second talk on this very kind of similar topic of myths and misconceptions that relates to gender and performance and gender and health at a later date. Well, thanks for listening. This was a little bit of a quicker overall discussion, even though it's a very important discussion to have. And we'll come back and have a much deeper discussion as it relates to the concepts of transgender identification and transgender athletes, and even more discussion in terms of female health and women health, particularly in terms of the myths and misconceptions out there, particularly in terms of the misunderstanding that many of the males that tend to set legal policies as relates to women health and female health have as relates to how the female physiology functions. But thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a little bit out of the discussion here. I know it's a bit of a hot button topic, and I understand it might have pushed some of your preconceived notions about gender, about biology, about genetics as relates to our gender identification and our sex identification. Please make sure you're following us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. Make sure you're giving us that big 5-star rating, giving us a big thumbs up, sharing with all your friends and family all of the work that we're putting out there for you to enjoy and learn about how the human body works and a lot of the myths and misconceptions out there that we have about the human body that we're hopefully dispelling as we go through the various different types of discussions.